Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Shah,
And I'm Dr. Altamash Raja,
and welcome to Medicine Redefined,
a podcast where we will explore the often overlooked but necessary components of health, what we consider to be the fundamentals.
We will investigate topics and practices that can give you and your patients the best chance to optimize a healthy lifestyle. It's time to move the needle forward and put the health back in healthcare. Welcome to an episode of The Progress Note. In medicine, the Progress Note is a medical record that documents a patient's clinical status or achievements during their care. It typically consists of four components: the subjective data, the objective data, the assessment, and lastly, the plan. It essentially is a systematic review in a point of time. Our goals with these episodes are to highlight mainstream practices, take a deeper dive, and approach polarized topics with nuance. While advancement is always happening in medicine, rethinking data as well as our beliefs is a rare occurrence. Join us as we continue to make progress, hold ourselves accountable, and redefine medicine. All right, progress note number 4 here with Dr. Raja. What's up, man? How are you?
Doing well, man. I'm doing well. Caught a little bug here, a little rhino, and it's only the second time around after having a child, so I feel like that's a win, you know. And
that's not bad. So for the listeners right now, you are enjoying the West Coast. You
Yes.
are in SoCal, and over here on the East Coast, man, all we're talking about right now in the clinic and hospitals is this quote unquote triple demic, right? Which I don't even think is a thing, but sure. I mean, increase in flu, RSV. And COVID, of course.
Yeah.
So all my friends with little ones are definitely catching a bug. So consider yourself lucky with only twice.
Yeah. I wanted to say I'm not complaining, but since I led the episode off with this, maybe I'm complaining a little bit, but I guess I'll stop there.
Sure. Well, hey, congrats. You just finished your boards for sports medicine.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, that's a big relief. So
It is. I'm not a fan of just waiting for such a long time. I never understand why, and I never will, and I don't think anybody really understands why we have to wait such a long time to wait between everything, right? It's between the exams, between
how long is it?
Match, between the rank list. I think the website said December 30th is expectation, so that's like almost 2 months.
That's crazy. Given that, how many people probably take it a year? Like 700?
Oh, less than
1,000?
that, because they offer it twice a year.
Less.
So I think 700 all for the whole year. And so half of them probably took it in the summer offering. So probably less than that. I don't know. Maybe they're like hand grading it individually on Scantron. I don't know. Who knows what was happening, man? You know?
Being that it's medicine, that's crazy. So maybe we should redefine that process as well.
Yeah. That'll be the next project.
That's wild.
Yeah. So what's on the agenda today, man? Let's get into it. Yeah.
Yeah. So today's progress notes, so this is our fourth one. We're going to be talking about sugar and whether it causes hyperactivity. Now, mainly in children, right? Because rarely do we ever tell an adult, oh, you shouldn't eat sugar because you're going to become hyper. But we often tell it to kids. So it's something that I've been hearing a lot, just from my friends who are parents. They'll be more aware of giving treats, cakes, candies. And since, it's middle of November, so kids might still have their Halloween candy around. Plus, we're also going into the holidays. So, we're thinking Thanksgiving, pies, then we're going into Christmas and New Year. So candy canes and more festivities and more sugar all around. So I thought this would be an appropriate time to at least release an episode to say, hey, does sugar actually cause hyperactivity in children?
Yeah, that's a great point. Actually, I when I was thinking about the topic, I was like, oh man, we're kind of past Halloween, but then you're right, Thanksgiving's around the corner, and then we got Christmas, and then New Year's, and then Valentine's Day. So it's just opportunities here and there. But that's the case for everything. I guess really all year round, there's always a holiday around the corner, isn't there? Yeah.
Always. That's right.
So maybe before we start, I think it might be worthwhile just to kind of the high level, because you kind of mentioned the why, why have this conversation. But I suppose for some folks, I think very few who might not really understand what ADHD or ADD is. I think most people have this stereotypical presentation, but do you think it's worth defining what maybe the medical terminology is loosely, and the different variations and
Sure.
that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So I mean, we're not psychiatrists, so I don't know the exact terminology, like you said. But I know there's ADD versus ADHD,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
common thought is, at least with sugar, and the reason why we don't give sugar to children is that they'll start, quote unquote, acting out, right? They'll start becoming hyper. Will start doing things that are out of characteristic of their baseline. And so when you look at ADHD, right, that hyperactivity disorder is in there. I believe you have to have 2 out of 3 situations, and I don't exactly know what the criteria are. But I know a teacher, a parent, and then I think maybe out in the community might be the third one
Yeah,
where
I think you have right. I think it's got to
two
be
out
in
of three
multiple
have
different
to.
environment settings, right? Can't just be at home, can't just be in school. So it's got to be in multiple different environments. But I think maybe I was. Let me just backtrack a little bit. I think
Yeah.
you talked about the hyperactivity part of it. I think
Hmm.
so. Most people think about the inattentive type as like the most common
Mm,
presentation, and then we've come to learn that there is a hyperactive type, which I think if you talk to parents,
right.
that I mean that's the premise of this discussion here today, and this is kind of the official diagnosis where psychiatry or NIH and stuff will describe three types, right? So you have the predominantly inattentive presentation, and that's essentially the person who can't stay on task, right? They're easily distractible, they can't focus, they can't finish, therefore, you know, a lot of fresh college students, medical students are will claim that these are
Hmm.
challenges, but I think we've talked a little bit off the record, or maybe even on the record before, about how really distractibility is one of the main reasons for that. But I digress. And the second type, which what you're talking about, is a hyperactivity, where you're kind of just jumping off just from couch to couch and just cannot calm
Hmm.
a child down, and this can be accompanied with lack of finishing one task because you're just jumping from one to next to the other. But this is the hyper focused, hyper vigilant type of presentation, and then the last type of presentation would be combined, and that's the one that becomes really challenging because you have these stages where you go from one to the next and you're like, wait, but you're not, but you are attentive and you're really hyper focused on your task and you get something done, but at the same
Hmm.
time, and those are the ones I think medically and clinically become the most challenging, and they're typically, I would say, diagnosed later on in life just because it's hard to catch,
Right.
for the reasons that we just mentioned. So I think that's kind of a quick overview. Anything you want to add on to that before we dive into the correlation, if you will?
Yeah, no, I think those are good points. So again, I think one of the things I want to bring up too is the the reason why we are truly going through the papers that we will is that there was actually a single study done in the 1970s, where a doctor, quote, removed sugar from children's diets, and he started to notice that their behavior
Mm,
improved. Later on, we find out that it wasn't truly just sugar that he removed; it was more about additives, food coloring, preservatives. And so, for the next 20 years, there was this correlation that, oh, it's sugar that is changing these kids' behaviors. And the paper wasn't really focused as much on, or at least I guess the theme that came out of the paper wasn't solely focused on the preservatives, food coloring, additives like it should have been.
right. So that's good, right?
Yeah,
So that we had a finding, and then somebody went back 20 years and said, well, in fact, what we
yeah,
believe to be true
right,
isn't actually true. But for some reason, the messaging carries on, right, for a long, long time, and that's the one that's harder to
right.
break. And you'll tell us why. So,
Exactly.
so get into it.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So got 3 papers here, right? So we're going to go in our SOAP format. So we just got done with this objective. So objectively, so first paper here is called Effects of Diets High in Sucrose or Aspartame. I always want to say aspartame for some reason
I like
because
that
it
better,
just
actually.
sounds cooler. But aspartame on the behavior and cognitive performance of children. So again, right now we're going to look at, does sugar affect behavior and cognitive performance in children? So this was a double-blind study done in 1994, right? This is not recent. This was done almost 20 years ago. And then it was basically, they took 2 groups. They took children, 25 children who were in their age range of 3 to 5 years old, and then 23 children who were 6 to 10 years old. And all these children have been described as sugar sensitive by their parents. So what they did was they had each group in different diets. Okay, there were 3 different diets, and essentially these 3 different diets were placed for 3 consecutive 3-week
Mm,
periods. Okay, so after every 3 weeks, they would change up the diet right away, and then after 3 weeks, change up the diet right away again. So what was the diet? So 3 different ones. The first one was it was high in sucrose with no artificial sweeteners. The second one was low in sucrose with an artificial sweetener. And the third diet was low in sucrose with a placebo sweetener. Okay, so those were kind of the three different tiers there. All of the diets were essentially free of additives, food coloring, and preservatives. Now, this was in the New England Journal of Medicine. I think the reason why it got in such a prestigious journal is this was a pretty involved study. Like everything was controlled. They had dietitians go to the house, remove all other foods. They traced the food with other compounds so that they could get urine samples to ensure that they were eating the right amount of sugar, the right amount of food. Now, on average, they were eating about 5 grams per kilo of body weight, right? So let's say the average is probably, I mean, more than 10 kilos, right? Like 15, 20 kilos maybe for some of these kids. So you're looking at 100 grams of sugar in this diet, at least the ones with the high in sucrose. So that is way above normal in a typical diet.
Mm-hmm.
So 100 grams of sugar, I mean, I don't even think we get, I definitely don't at least, but that's a lot. So the parents were then asked to monitor and assess behavior and cognitive tests. Now, there are a bunch of them. I did not know any of these tests, but going through them, they basically assessed cognitive ability, attention, focus, doing some problem solving, behavioral tests. They'll look at motor skills. They'll look to see if there are any tremors. They'll look to see if there's any hyperactivity. So it kind of ran the gamut. And looking at it from a glance, there were probably 8 to 10 tests that they looked at in
Mm-hmm.
combination. But overall, they found no difference. They found no difference in any of the diets in any of the children ranging from 3 to 10 years old. So high sugar, low sugar, there was no difference in the cognitive abilities or the behavioral abilities of the children. So that's the first one there in the New England Journal of Medicine.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, and I think for those aspartame or aspartame as we're calling it now,
Yeah.
that's typically like equal, I think, or NutraSweet, or I think, right. Those are the ones that the brands that people are going to see. Um,
Mm-hmm.
gets a lot of heat for a lot of different things, and is responsible for really ADHD to, as you mentioned, from I guess, according to some people, and cancer and dysbiosis and blah blah
Mm-hmm.
blah.
Gut
Keep going. So
microbiome. Yep.
yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly.
Exactly.
All right, so that one is a negative finding. What we'll call it, would say okay, and but some people might say, well, Dark that's more than 20 years old. Do you have anything more recent for us? What does the current evidence suggest for this?
You know what? I gotta look at the dates actually on this second one, but there is a meta-analysis that was done in JAMA called "The Effect of Sugar and Behavior on Cognition in Children." Now, of course, the way medical societies work is you got to pay just to get the full text, so that's unfortunate. So I couldn't get the full text on this JAMA one, but essentially they did 16 studies, and I'm pulling it up right now to see what year this was done. If my internet gets any faster, you might beat me to it.
Yeah, this looks like this is also in the 90s. Is Woolrich the first author?
And this thing forever to go.
Yeah, it looks like the
It's
the,
like
the one that you're referencing, JAMA, is maybe actually.
it's on JAMA,
Yeah, yeah. Also 1990,
also 90s.
99,
Yeah.
96. So
So it's interesting. I think most of the studies are actually done in the 90s and early 2000s.
yeah.
But essentially, this meta-analysis, right? 16 studies also showed the same thing. No association, but they did say that you can't rule out any small effect that sugar or substitutes may have on children or subsets of children, right? So now we're looking at particular children with any type of special conditions, whether it's genetics, whether it's mental health. So further research would need to be done on that in a particular subset. But overall, if you're looking at like a generalized population, this meta-analysis showed that there was no effect on the same kind of things that we looked at the first study.
Okay. So another null finding. Anything else with
Correct.
regard to that? So I guess maybe at this point, well, actually, what we'll do is maybe we'll kind of bring it together to at the end, if we can answer the questions, because
Mm.
people are going to probably wonder, okay, well, what does cause it, right? I think we always have to propose an alternative, um, or at least we think we do. But you said you might have mentioned you had one more.
Yeah, absolutely. So this third one is not looking at cognitive and behavioral correlation with sugar. It's actually looking at how we perceive kids who take sugar from a mother's perspective. So this title was called Effects of Sugar Interaction Expectancies on Mother-Child Interactions. Okay, so they took 35 5 to 7 year old boys who again were reported to be quote unquote sugar sensitive by their mothers. So the mothers were then assigned to an experimental, which was the large dose of sugar, or a control, which was the placebo. But in actuality, all the children got aspartame. So what the researchers did was that they videotaped the mom and child interacting after these children got their diets, right? After they got their high dose of sugar or they got their placebo. And then they were questioned about the interaction as well. So what they showed, at least through videotaping, was that the mothers in the sugar expectancy group, so the ones that were supposed to get the large dose of sugar, they rated their children as more hyperactive.
Mm.
And the researchers also noted that the moms were more controlling and in a way of more physical closeness, more criticism, and they would actually talk to their kids more so than the moms would with the placebo group. So if this is more of kind of just a behavioral study, or at least looking at that aspect of this whole debate of does sugar cause hyperactivity? So is it more perception? It's kind of what this paper is answering.
Right. It's kind of the anticipatory response, right? Especially like after Halloween, you're like, oh God, they're going to be jumping off the walls. And then maybe you're a little bit more keen to that response.
Yep, exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah, man.
Now,
So those were kind of the three that I pulled up. So
yeah,
yeah.
no, I like that. I do think this is something that, I know you mentioned that you have folks that are in your circle or some version of that, and they've got children, and this is a concern. I think it's a valid concern as a parent because I think a lot about. Of course, we think a lot about nutrition and my own food, and then now I'm responsible for another life form, and so I have to think very much about what I'm going to put in front of my child, and it's
Hmm.
essentially about building these habits, right? And so at the same time, we've talked about being balanced and can't control all the environments, right? Can't go to school and at the lunch and be like, nope, can't serve this to my child, right? That's not also realistic. And we talked
Right.
about, when they go to a birthday party or something, like they're going to be, there's might be cake there might be whatever, and so we have to be able to find that balance. And so these fear-based messaging, particularly with something like this, right? So I think one of the things that I failed to
Hmm.
mention when I was describing the multiple types is this is a neurodevelopmental disorder, right? And I think ultimately kind of what I'm getting from what you're describing and also from what we've learned is that we don't truly know one cause for this, right? We think genetics play a role. We're questioning whether or not our environmental factors such as sugar plays a role. And a lot of people have asked that question and are looking at it as well. And there are some associations. I do think there was a study that I do remember at some point looking at. I could not quote it to you, but maybe if I could find it. It was much more recent. I want to say in the last 3 to 5 years, which was a meta-analysis looking at sugar sweetened beverages, maybe, or actual sugar consumption,
Hmm.
and the effects of or its correlation with ADHD. And it did find that there was an
Hmm.
association with children who did consume more sugar had a higher prevalence of ADHD. But that it's very
Yeah.
important when we talked about before that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. And I think what
Right.
has been documented more often than not are the effects of sugar on the brain. And that's not to say so that equates to ADHD, right? Because ADHD is a unique process that what we're saying here is we don't necessarily know that sugar can manipulate that. That's again, that's not the same thing as saying sugar doesn't affect the brain in some way. In fact, sugar is the primary preferred fuel source for the brain. Sorry, you were going to say something there.
Hmm. Right. No, no, yeah. So I think it's important to note here too, right? Like hyperactivity in the chronic sense would be the ADHD,
Sure.
which is what you're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
From the neurodevelopment. I think these studies are looking more at the acute bouts of
Right.
hyperactivity, right? And I think a lot of parents think that too. They'll say, "Oh, I give my kid a piece of chocolate, boom, they're gonna like start being hyperactive."
Right.
So I think it's important to note, at least for the audience, that hey, there's kind of two distinctions here with hyperactivity. There's the acute, which is you give a kid a piece of chocolate or candy and they become hyperactive right after, versus you consistently have high sugar in your diet. Does that lead to a neurodevelopment issue such as ADD, ADHD down the road?
Right.
or I mean, who knows how long, right? I think that's what you're talking about. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think my sense is at this point, the answer to that is question is we don't know. Right. I think we can speculate. I
Hmm.
mean, is that kind of your takeaway as well?
Yeah, no, I totally agree, right? It's so interesting that it was a 1970s paper that showed this link, and now we know this link, at least in the acute sense, is false, right? And from what I mentioned in the subjective sense is I see a lot of people talk about the acute sense, like, oh, I don't want to give my kid candy at 4 o'clock because then they're not going to be able to go to sleep,
Right.
which we like based off these papers, we know is not true, right? We are falsely associating giving candy to this increase in um, activity that we perceive. But it's interesting if you read a lot of these blogs and you read a lot of the research out there too. It shows that most of the time these kids are having candy, it's going to be around an exciting time, right? It's going to be at a birthday party.
Mm,
It's going to be maybe at a family gathering. So they're already going to be excited. They're already going to be
stimulated. Yeah.
hyperactive. Right, they're going to be stimulated.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily sugar itself doing that. It's the environment, right? And I think one of the blogs that I read was, "Hey, parents, just take note next time that if there is candy around, or you're thinking that this might make them hyperactive and stimulated, instead just look at the environment and see, whether it's actually that."
Right.
Because again, it's funny how we only tell children not to have these sweets because they're gonna get stimulated, but when it comes to adults, we don't really say anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
So no one ever talks about that distinction, right? So I think
Yeah.
it's just, I don't know if it's just kind of like a old wise tale just to get kids to eat healthier. It doesn't seem like that based off, kind of this 1970s paper. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of my assessment out of the whole thing is that, again, I think we do need more research. When we look at 90s and we look at aspartame and artificial sweeteners, I mean, now we're starting to research that a little bit more. So going back, hey, what effects did those actually have on the study and whatnot? So I think it's cool to kind of resurface this a little bit.
Yeah. No, I do agree. Yeah. I think that those are some really awesome points that you made. I mean, I think again about the fact that if we're doing candy, but at the same time, Elmo's on the background, I know that again, my child has difficulty winding down, going to sleep. And I think that's much the case with us as well, right? I think again, diet plays a role, but at the same time, we talk about putting these softwares on our screens to dim the light, and you got the blue blockers glasses. We talk about doing
Yeah,
relaxation techniques, whether it's hot shower, cold shower, whatever, all the kind of stuff, wind down routine. And the idea is that maybe it's a cumulative effect for multiple of those things rather than just one specific thing. There is no magic pill, magic bullet, magic candy bar.
right,
Um, the other thing I will say, just to play devil's advocate for a second, is there might be some individual variability, and I'm not here to say, and
right,
I don't want to speak for you here, but I do think we've talked about that. Hey, you do have to be mindful of, hey, like sometimes, you know, the studies might show a certain thing, but your body doesn't read that paper, or your body hasn't read the textbook, and your biology behaves, or your child's
sure,
biology behaves a different way. So to your point about, we're not giving any parental advice here, but to your point about hey, let's just be mindful
mm,
about, hey, what is it, and can we disentangle that from the environment and the stimulation and the parties and all that kind of stuff. And if that in fact is the case, then maybe some adjustments are in order, right? I think
yeah.
that's
I
kind
mean,
of the piece that I'm taking away from that.
yeah, absolutely. Like I think about it all the time with people who are lactose intolerant, right? So
Uh-huh.
let's say they do no dairy at all for like 6 months and then they introduce a little bit of dairy. I mean, that little bit of dairy is going to wreck their
Uh-huh.
stomach versus somebody who just does a little bit of dairy every single day and then they have a bigger amount of dairy one day. They might not feel that effect as much because their gut microbiome or whatever is kind of already used to the mechanisms of digesting that dairy product. Same thing kind of goes for a kid. I mean, you might have a kid who eats, let's say, 20 grams of sugar a day, one day goes up to 60, and you don't really notice a difference because they're already baseline kind of having some sugar versus a kid who has no sugar at all, pretty strict diet, let's say, and then they have an increased bout of sugar. I mean, who knows how that's going to affect? And just kind of like that second paper said, you can't really rule out even a small effect of sugar in a subset of children, which I think comes down to that genetic variability.
For sure. Awesome. And then
Yeah.
I guess so. A lot of this is looking at the acute thing, and I guess I was looking at it more of the chronic response, which I do think is
Sure.
worth talking. But I think that becomes way more complex. Um, and
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look at more papers to actually to see that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think, honestly, I think at some point maybe you and I were talking about different things, but I think that's the one that becomes really really challenging because it's pathological versus physiological responses essentially is what we're talking about. And yeah, it is
Yeah,
interesting. Hopefully, it puts some people at ease and makes people a little bit more informed. I know it's made me a bit more
for
informed
sure.
about how I'm going to think about these things moving forward. So
So
I
let
don't
me
know.
ask you, what's your plan here, right? So
Yeah,
the,
yeah,
the
that's a good
P and the
question.
soap,
Yeah,
the plan. What are you gonna do?
I don't think this dissuades me from giving a particular food in any sense to my child moving forward, or even myself at a certain time of the day, right? I mean, we talked about, um, you know, even if you told me, and even if the literature supported that it does in fact cause an acute hyperactivity response or whatever for a certain sustained period of time, I would argue is that let's just say that we're enjoying candy or dessert, something sugary at dinner time as a family with my child, then that bonding experience will create a relaxation response. How do we measure that, right? And I think one of the things that
Hmm.
we've talked about before is that food is, especially I think in our culture and a lot of other cultures across the world, it's a language, right? It's a way to for people to come together at the table. It's not just like input
For
fuel,
sure.
output, phosphocreatine or carbohydrates and that kind of stuff and triglycerides. It's a way for people to come together. And again, things that we talked about when we look at the blue zones is one of the foundations that they have is people have these close relationships, and I hope I'm still making sense a little bit. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, how do we measure the other side of it? What are the positives that are coming from it, and does that outweigh
Hmm.
the potential negative if you were or if anybody was to be able to show it? So I would argue that is, I wouldn't be convinced. I think much like anything else, just assessing the situation on an individual level for me, my family, whoever people I'm working with directly, and giving them the same guidance that, hey, see what the response is and how things are going, and if they're not going according to the outcome, whatever that outcome is that you want, then change a variable and see what happens.
Yeah, I like that, man. Yeah, I would say it's kind of the same for me. I mean, obviously, we're not pediatricians, so from a medical standpoint, there's not much that we would tell our patients. But definitely from a parenting standpoint, right? Like you're a father. I'll hopefully be one in the next couple of years or so. And I always think about parenting, and it's funny because I remember me being a child. I had such a sweet tooth. I mean, I would literally search for candy around the
Mm,
house. Um, and I was very hyperactive, and I mean, I still am. I'm a huge extrovert. I'm pretty out there and stimulated all the time. And so read these papers, I remember just a lot of times growing up being like, oh, you can't have this candy because, this is how you act, right? And I was always told that. So it's funny looking at these papers and being like, maybe there wasn't actually that link for me. Maybe it was just because I was always stimulated. I was always looking for something to do, but I just also loved candy, right? And so for a long time, I haven't had the best relationship with like sugar. I've always binged it or I've always stayed away from it, right? And after kind of getting this knowledge, I've learned that hey, I can actually shape my relationship with candy and understand that hey, I can have this. It's not going to cause me to be crazy, but I don't have to go overboard and make it all or nothing. And so that's what I look forward to at least when I have kids is having them enjoy, as well, just like you said, but teaching them as to why they shouldn't have sugar every day and but not making this the hyperactivity the scapegoat, but more so understanding about health, obesity, all the things we touch on this podcast. And I'm a big proponent of always teaching kids why, kind of like what Ben Greenfield talks about, having them eventually become teenagers and adults. They're going to have to make these choices one day, so even at whatever early age they can start to comprehend these things. So that's kind of where I think of this stuff.
right on. I love it. On that note, I think
Cool, man.
I will disclose I just had 3 truffles before we started, so maybe I'll do another one
Ooh,
on.
you're ready.
I
on
don't
my
know.
behalf.
One could argue maybe that's why I wasn't on the same page as you in the beginning, but who knows? um,
Hey, we hit two birds with a stone. Some chronic, acute, went through
I love
papers.
it.
I think it was a good episode.
Awesome. Now I didn't ask you in the beginning, and so it'd be rude of me to not bring the listeners up to date on what's going on with you. You talked a little bit about the tridemic. Is that what you call it? Tripidemic? Tripidemic?
The triple demic, man. I think it was
Triple
like New
demic.
York Times or one of those papers that
Interesting.
Um,
Aside from that,
yeah.
what's the word? Any trips coming up? I know people are
Much
excited to follow your journey on
else?
that.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So we're going to where? My God, I just had like a blank for a brain fart. Mexico City and
Oh,
Colombia.
okay.
End of
Very
December.
nice.
So
Very nice.
that'll be a fun trip. But yeah, not much else. I've been a lot more active on Twitter, so people can follow me on Twitter before it disappears. They're thinking Twitter might just go under. Everyone's resigning right now.
Oh yeah,
But I'm blue check verified. I'm now famous. No, I paid for it. Um,
yeah. I love
so
that.
that's that. Oh, lastly, man, I don't know if you watch Broadway musicals, but Hamilton. So Mira and I just watched on Disney Plus. Unfreaking believable. Like
Yeah,
absolutely the best Broadway show I probably will ever see in my lifetime. And I've only seen Aladdin, but still, it was incredible. Like I was not expecting that. I never understood the hype. For like the last 2 years, I thought it was just some like colonial American history, boring music, and it's like rap music. It takes you through all the emotions. You're learning a lot. It was absolute 3 hours of just unreal. Yeah, I don't understand how they come up with this stuff. Honestly, it's incredible.
awesome.
Must watch for all the listeners out there if you haven't. Yeah.
I will put that on the list. And while we're at it, another one on Disney Plus. The series just got released. Limitless. One of my favorite
Oh, I gotta check
superheroes.
that out.
Chris Hemsworth is, I think, starring it, and somebody that we listen to and we
Hmm.
quote somewhat frequently is Peter Attia, is one of the longevity experts, talking about essentially longevity, all the things that I think we're interested in. So we'll be sure to check that out, and maybe we'll do like a little recap at some point, a review for folks. So two
Yeah.
things for the upcoming weekend for people to check out as they enjoy some desserts and cakes and candy or whatever makes you happy.
All right. Thanks again for listening to another episode of The Progress Note. Now, if you're a parent or maybe you're just an observer of a child getting candy, be sure to see whether that child is actually getting stimulated and becoming hyperactive. I think it would be a cool experiment now that we know what the data shows. So, when Thanksgiving comes and then Christmas, New Year's, make that a part of your experiment. So I think it'll be cool to see. If you know any parents who would be interested in learning about this topic, please be sure to send them this podcast. We are on Apple, Spotify, and all other major platforms. And if you are enjoying this podcast, please, 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 for whatever platform you're on, leave us a review and a rating. It really helps us in terms of expanding our reach and getting these episodes into the hands of many. And as always, the medical disclaimer. Everything discussed in this podcast is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute the practice of medicine, and we are not providing medical advice. No physician-patient relationship is formed, and anything discussed in this podcast does not represent the views of our employers. We recommend that you seek the guidance of your personal physician regarding any specific health-related issues. And for our listeners out there who celebrate Thanksgiving, wishing you a very, very happy Thanksgiving. See you later.